North Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, or even closer to home, the nuclear threat that Vladimir Putin has repeated several times since he launched his disastrous invasion of Ukraine. Nuclear risk is now back on the table. The fall of the Berlin Wall on the 8th of November 1989 meant that the world entered an era of peace, prosperity, and commerce, and nuclear mushroom clouds, bombing tests, and bunkers dug deep into the sides of great mountains became a thing of the past. Now, in a way, that era seems to be over, and this is something that is perfectly reflected in news stories like this one.
China likely to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, Pentagon. 3 nuclear superpowers rather than 2 usher in a new strategic era. China is on track to massively expand its nuclear arsenal, just as Russia suspends the last major arms control treaty. It augurs a new world in which Beijing, Moscow, and Washington will likely be atomic peers.
And pay attention, because as we shall see, it seems that Vladimir Putin's own government is also giving top priority to nuclear rearmament. We are talking about a new political and military environment that is changing the balance of nuclear power that was forged in the Cold War and that has left us all at VisualPolitik wondering precisely which countries have nuclear weapons today and where are they located? Why, with so many open battlefronts, does the Kremlin seem to be making the nuclear area its #1 priority? What might this new race entail? Well, in this video, we are going to answer all of these questions. So, let's get cracking. Fear of nuclear disaster marked much of the second half of the 20th century. After World War II, more and more countries gradually acquired this capability. For example, in 1949, the Soviet Union ended Washington's monopoly. In 1953, the United Kingdom did the same, and in 1964, both France and China reached the goal of being nuclear capable. However, by far, the Soviet Union and the United States were the two main players in this whole story. This is something we all know. Between them, they accounted for nearly 70% of the nuclear arsenal, and as you can see, they have been responsible for 1,745 of the 2,059 nuclear tests that have been carried out around the globe. And don't think that when we talk about nuclear weapons, we are talking about a few dozen. Not at all. During the early stages of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States went berserk, stocking their inventories. For example, to give you an idea, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the red button in the White House was already connected to 25,540 nuclear warheads. At that time, the Soviet Union only had 3,346, but it would soon catch up and surpass, at least in numbers, the USA itself. In total, at its peak in the mid-1980s, the global inventory reached an estimated 70,000 nuclear warheads. That's crazy. And that, VisualPolitik viewers, is how the doctrine known as mutually assured destruction was forged. Mad. That is, both the United States and the Soviet Union had gone so far in the nuclear race that if, for one reason or another, they attacked each other, both would be annihilated. Their own nations and perhaps a good part of the rest of the world would go with them. But you already know all this. It is something that has been talked about ad nauseum. And the truth is that it worked. Perhaps against all odds, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction made the world a safer place. Now, do you know what the problem was? Imagine what it means to have tens of thousands of nuclear warheads susceptible at any moment to any misunderstanding, a terrorist operation, or human error. And wham! Disaster would suddenly be on us and there would be no turning back. Obviously, the more weapons you have, the more difficult it is to control them properly and the more likely it is that a failure will occur. Well, precisely for that reason, the two powers understood that they had to do something about it. Specifically, to reach agreements to reduce this massive danger. And so, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was born, an international agreement that put the brakes on the race of many countries to acquire these types of weapons. Not only that, in 1972, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, was reached. This agreement limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and ballistic submarines of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Then, in 1979, it went further with the approval of SALT II. The result of these agreements? Well, take a look at this. As you can see, the SALT treaties paved the way for the reduction of nuclear arsenals, but they were not the last ones. In 1987, the two powers signed a treaty to limit intermediate-range nuclear forces, and from 1991, with the Soviet Union now dissolved, Russia continued with the same policy by finalizing the START I and II agreements, an improved version of SALT. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its economy gave the United States the upper hand again. Yes, as you have seen, Russia did have more nuclear weapons, but many of them were old, inefficient, and the delivery options were much more restricted. The United States, on the other hand, had succeeded in developing modern strategic bombers such as the B-2, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental missiles of much greater precision and reliability, not to mention new anti-missile systems such as the THAAD. For those of you who are not familiar with it, THAAD is a mobile system designed to intercept medium and long-range ballistic missiles. The fact that it is mobile allows it to protect large territories and entire cities as well. This system makes use of advanced radar to detect and track enemy missiles, transmitting their trajectory in real time to other allied missile defense systems. Then there is also Aegis, a similar system but operated from warships. And above all, we have the GMD Intercept System, a intercontinental ballistic missile defense system, a program in which the United States has invested more than $100 billion since the beginning of the 21st century, and which is now receiving a lot of attention and record budget allocations. Not surprisingly, in these fields, the economic and technological superiority of the United States is evident. So let's just say that mutually assured destruction became a kind of mutually assured confidence, although the truth is that the balance was, and increasingly is, unbalanced in favor of the American power.
The characteristics of the two nuclear weapons systems complicated any workable definition of balance. Soviet strategic systems were large and imprecise. US weapons were more transportable and accurate. Henry Kissinger in leadership.
It is for this reason that the Kremlin has again begun to worry about expanding and renewing its strategic capabilities. But before addressing this question, we need to look at exactly where we are globally. This VisualPolitik community is a cross-section of the current inventory of nuclear powers. Check this out.
The nuclear weapons of the 21st century.
Do you want to hear a surprising fact? From some 70,000 nuclear weapons worldwide, we are now down to less than 14,000. And that's despite the fact that Pakistan, Israel, India, and North Korea have more recently joined the nuclear club. In fact, with the exception of China, all the historical nuclear powers, that is, the countries that have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, have reduced their atomic arsenals. To give you an idea, this would be the current estimate of nuclear weapons per country that we can find around the world right now. As you can see, the gradual reduction of nuclear warheads has continued. Since the 1970s, the United States has destroyed about 80% of its arsenal. And in addition to the agreements we have already seen, in 2010, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and the President of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, signed START 3 in Prague, a new treaty providing an additional reduction of 1/3 of the arsenal of both countries. It entailed the elimination of about 1,750 nuclear warheads in each of the two inventories. In 2021, this agreement was extended for another 5 years, although Russia's compliance with it is being highly questioned. In any case, fewer weapons does not mean less capacity. To give you an idea, the US LGM-30G, Minuteman III, and the Russian RS-28 Sarmat, the continental missiles par excellence of these countries, have a destructive capacity between 500 and 1,500 times greater than the Little Boy launched on Hiroshima in 1945. So this would be, broadly speaking, the basic characteristics of the world's nuclear inventory. And remember that here we have to make a note. Countries like North Korea, although it has a very small inventory, or Iran, if it finally gets the bomb, pose a huge risk, perhaps much greater than we might think. Why? Because of what we could call the risk of informality. Think about it. We are talking about two pariah countries, very opaque, and with elites very disconnected from the rest of the world. Two countries that, to top it all off, are used to negotiating with the formula of pressure, blackmail, and extortion to achieve their ends. These countries could themselves provoke the start of a major international conflict. For example, North Korea is expected to soon have the capability to directly attack the United States with ballistic missiles, which would allow it to raise the stakes in any negotiation. This would automatically translate into much more tension, and let's not even talk about possible failures.
North Korea displays enough ICBMs to overwhelm US defense system against them. Administration after administration has failed to stop North Korea from developing such large numbers of an ICBM that could possibly reach the United States.
Precisely because of this, and also because of the appearance of the new hypersonic missiles, the Pentagon is now accelerating plans for the development of missile defense systems such as the GMD interceptor system we have already mentioned. New interceptors are even being developed practically from scratch. This is what is known as the New Generation Interceptor Project, new systems that in the future could be deployed in the rest of the allied countries.
Missile Defense Agency requests $10.9 billion in FY24 and tens of billions more after that.
But Can you imagine if in the meantime a failure were to occur and in a few years a North Korean missile landed not in the United States but in a country like Japan or South Korea? It would be a colossal disaster, and yes, it could end up provoking a new large-scale conflict. But beyond these risks, which, what can I say, however rote they might be, are very concerning, we now come to the crucial point. The Ukrainian war has completely changed the political and military landscape. The question is, where exactly are we now? Why did we say at the beginning of this video that Putin had nuclear power in his sights? Well, we're going to look at that right now.
What do the claws of the modern Russian bear look like?
Vladimir Putin took over from Medvedev and returned to the presidency in 2012, only 2 years after signing the START III treaty. And while the Russian dictator never really ceased to be the one in charge, and although in 2021 he was in favor of extending the treaty's validity by 5 years, Putin was always critical of nuclear disarmament. Let's just say that he considers that this is a path that seeks to subdue the Russian bear, and that is why the Russian motherland is set to follow another, very different path. Where is the START III agreement currently? What difference does it make? You know that the Kremlin only fulfills its commitments when it suits the Kremlin.
To those who in the last 15 years have tried to accelerate an arms race and seek a unilateral advantage against Russia, everything they have tried to avoid with that policy has already happened. No one has succeeded in stopping Russia. Vladimir Putin in 2018, after announcing a new series of breakthroughs in Russia's nuclear arsenal.
From a realpolitik point of view, this position makes a lot of sense. I don't think it will surprise you if I say that it is obvious that the only strength Russia has today is its nuclear arsenal. Without it, this country would be practically nothing. We are talking about an aging country with an economy that has been depressed for years and whose conventional army is not even capable of defeating the Ukrainian army. That is why its only advantage at present is the nuclear threat, or rather, nuclear blackmail.
Boris Johnson claims Putin threatened him to launch a missile against the UK, but the Kremlin say he's lying. Lavrov warns against underestimating threat of nuclear war.
In part, these threats are what made the arrival of military aid to Ukraine more rapid than it probably would have been in a different context. And while they didn't quite work, it's something that they've repeated over and over again since the onset of the war.
Russia's Medvedev says arms supplies to Kyiv threaten global nuclear catastrophe. Medvedev says threat of nuclear war growing.
But do you know what? In this, Russia faces two major problems. On the one hand, a large part of its arsenal is becoming obsolete. In Ukraine, we have already seen the enormous problems of the technology, reliability, obsolescence, and supply of Russian equipment. Well, there is no reason to believe that things are any different in the nuclear field. On the other hand, there is the US bid to develop anti-missile systems. If the US gets an effective system, then Russia's deterrent capability would go out of the window.
Competitive pressures in the field of strategic nuclear weapons could also be conditioned by Russia's assessment of US missile defense capabilities. Moscow has demonstrated that it will go to great lengths and bear considerable costs to ensure that its strategic nuclear forces could reliably overcome US missile defenses. US National Defense University Strategic Assessment 2020.
This is what explains why in recent years we have heard so much about the new strategic weapons and the reason why the Kremlin decided that a poor country with an economy as in decline as Russia's will allocate a lot of resources to new submarines, supersonic missiles, and strategic bombing, which is exactly what many of you will come across in news stories like these ones.
Russian Navy takes delivery of weapon of the apocalypse as Putin delivers on strategic threat. Poseidon is one of the next generation weapons announced by Moscow 5 years ago, with the capacity to devastate coastal cities and attack naval battle groups undetected. Russia to test new hypersonic missile in drills with China and South Africa. Russia is rapidly expanding its nuclear submarine fleet.
And yes, I know what the vast majority of you are thinking. But let me see, Grant. What are you telling me here? The Russians are not even able to supply their own front. And what about the sanctions that they're under at the moment? Well, yes, it is true. If anything has become clear in Ukraine, it is that Russian capabilities are questionable, to say the least. But the point is that this is a high priority for the Kremlin. Its political capital and perhaps even its very survival depends on this deterrence capability. And remember, I'm not just talking about Vladimir Putin, nor am I referring exclusively to large military equipment. Take a look at this.
Russia is upgrading many of its shorter-range, so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons and introducing new types. Part of the rationale is that non-strategic nuclear weapons are needed to counter the superiority of NATO's conventional forces. Bulletin of the Nuclear Scientists.
In other words, we are talking about big weapons that are expected to be able to put fear into the United States and smaller, easier to build weapons that can frighten old Europe. And don't forget that with a negotiation on the Ukraine conflict pending, these kinds of capabilities could be very important in tipping that balance. Think about it, if you want to put pressure on Kyiv, what better than to terrify its friends?
Putin says Moscow will place nuclear weapons in Belarus. US reacts cautiously.
The problem is that this is something new. You may think that the Soviet Union or the United States also used their huge nuclear arsenal to threaten and terrorize left and right during the Cold War, but the truth is that that was not the case. Let's just say that this was a subject that was treated much more carefully and delicately. The Soviet Union never threatened to use a nuclear weapon in Afghanistan despite the support the opposition groups received from the United States, nor in Afghanistan, nor anywhere else. Nor did the United States ever threaten to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. That is, it is something totally different from what Putin is doing now, and also Kim Jong-un and perhaps the Ayatollahs if they get the bomb. And this is something that sets off all of the alarms. So what's the immediate consequence? The United States will have to take missile defense and non-proliferation much more seriously. What happens is that achieving this in Europe may prove to be much more difficult because of distance and time. Is it possible to develop a kind of Iron Dome? Probably, yes. Would it cost a lot of money? Yes. A lot. Should Europe embark on this adventure? Everything seems to indicate yes. The unreliability being demonstrated not only by Pyongyang, but also by Moscow means that the mere deterrence may no longer be enough. And the most important question of all, will Europe actually do anything? Probably not. And VisualPolitik community, this is one of the great trump cards that Moscow is still counting on to maintain its influence and gain further concessions in the medium term. This is why, despite everything that is happening, Putin is still going strong with his nuclear forces. But having come this far, it's over to you. To what extent do you consider that the nuclear risk has increased again? Do you think that Putin's Russia will be able to maintain its deterrence capability? Will the United States to be able to develop an effective missile defense system once and for all? How can we protect ourselves, and what do we have to do in the face of new nuclear threats? You can leave us your opinions in the comments below, and let's open a respectful debate. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.